नमो तस्स भगवतो अरहतो सम्मा संबुद्धस्स। नमो तस्स भगवतो अरहतो सम्मा संबुद्धस्स। नमो तस्स भगवतो अरहतो सम्मा संबुद्धस्स. So today we will be continuing to study what is called the critiques of his doctrine. And as a critique of his doctrine, we have already covered the part 3, half of it. And today we are going to cover subparts 4, 5, and 6. And as we continue to study this, we can begin to feel that there are certain themes in the Buddha and his Dhamma which are recurring again and again, and that's the way we are being offered various perspectives on the Buddha's teachings. And this part 4, 5, and 6 is not an exception to the clarification or the clarity that Baba Ambedkar has tried to give us all, so that we can understand the Buddha's Dhamma very well. And that's why I think this subpart 4, subpart 5, and subpart 6 are very important for us to understand, to respond to the critics of the Buddha's Dhamma. So the subpart 4 is titled as The Charge of Preaching Virtue and Creating Gloom. So that was one of the, even it's still in, this view is still in circulation, that the Buddha's Dhamma is gloomy. It's not optimistic, it's pessimistic. And the Buddha only teaches, preaches only virtue, and he creates gloom. And there are three important teachings of the Buddha, the two important teachings of the Buddha: the teaching of dukkha and the teaching of impermanence. And based on these teachings, the Buddha's Dhamma is considered to be pessimistic, gloomy. And then the Buddha is charged with critique of theory of soul and rebirth, because the Buddha categorically denied the existence of any permanent entity called soul, and therefore the critique of the theory of soul and rebirth. So this is the second point of his doctrine that is being criticized. The third doctrinal point that is being criticized is the charge of being an annihilationist. Very difficult, tongue-twisting word. Annihilationist. So you see, this is these three charges, and how Baba Ambedkar had answered them, I think is very critical for us to understand. So we begin with what is the charge on the Buddha's teaching of preaching virtue and creating gloom. So what is it? So the subpart 4 is further divided into another part 1, which is titled as Dukkha as the cause of gloom. Because this is so important, what I'm going to do, I'm going to read it through, and then I'm going to gloss over some of the very important and interesting points that the Buddha, and by virtue of the presentation of Baba Sahib, had made. So let me begin to read it. It's a very small reading, and then I'm going to gloss over some of the very essential points. So dukkha as the cause of gloom. Because the Buddha teaches that there is suffering in the world, the Buddhism is considered to be what is called the gloomy or pessimistic doctrine or teaching. So now let's look at it. So one, dukkha in its original sense given to it by Kapila means unrest and commotion. So you see, there was an ancient philosopher, Kapila, and we have seen the reference of Kapila coming in the Buddha and his Dhamma previously. And two of the teachers under whom the Buddha taught, Buddha learned first lessons of his philosophy, Alar Kalam and Udaka Ramaputta. They were considered to be the philosophers or the practitioners of Sankhya philosophy. Sankhya has to do with number, Sankhya. And later, it was a non-Brahminical school, but it was then in the medieval time, it was included into the 6 philosophical schools of the Brahminical traditions, but it was originally never a Brahminical school. And we have also seen that Kapila might be having reference to Kapilavastu, the city of Kapila. And Kapila was a very famous philosopher of the ancient time, and he taught the doctrine of Purush and Prakriti. And he taught that, because this Purush and Prakriti, this theme of, the higher and lower uniting together has been taken as a center point in the Indian non-Buddhist Indian traditions. So the Buddha, of course, learned a lot from Sankhya philosophy, and this is what is very important here, to understand the background of the philosophy. So one, dukkha in its original sense given to it by Kapila means unrest and commotion. Initially, it had a metaphysical meaning. So metaphysically, because there is unrest in the world, there is Purusha and Prakriti not in harmony. Therefore, there is unrest, and because of that unrest, and commotion, it was called the dukkha. So that was the original metaphysical definition according to the Sankhya philosophy of dukkha. Later on, it acquired the meaning of suffering and sorrow, and in the latter period, the world underwent radical change, and it has a connotation of what is called the suffering and sorrow. The two senses were not far detached; they were very close. So, in a metaphysical sense, in terms of the truth or the reality, which is called the metaphysics in philosophy, and the social and economic. These are two important aspects. And social, as we know, is related to ethics, as in economics, as we know it today, related to ethics. So you see, the unrest brings sorrow and suffering. So what if there is a disharmony? If there is no harmony, then it leads to sorrow and suffering. And later on, the word dukkha acquired the meaning of sorrow and suffering from social and economic causes. This is a very important point. The dukkha has now gone down from the metaphysical meaning to the social and economic sense in terms of causing sorrow and suffering from social and economic causes. In what sense did the Buddha use the word sorrow and suffering? So how is it that the Buddha used the word sorrow and suffering? What is the connotation of the word dukkha? And we have seen in the previous classes that the Buddha had given a lot of definitions of the word dukkha, and in the Buddhist literature and Buddhist canonical literature, we know that there are lots and lots of definitions of the word dukkha. One of the meanings of the word dukkha is dukkharena khamati iti dukkham, something which is difficult to endure. So anything in the world which is difficult to endure is suffering. And then there are three ways by which suffering is dukkha is defined. The normal dukkhata dukkham, like if we have toothache or body ache, it's a normal dukkha that we all have to undergo. And then the suffering due to change, because the world has a nature of change, impermanence. That's why we suffer, because nothing remains as it is. Nothing in the world is going to remain as it is, and that's the fundamental fact of the world. There is nothing is constant. So because of the change, we suffer, and because of the conditioned, everything is conditioned. Everything is like coming together of many things, and they are not stable. There is no inherent stability, and therefore we suffer. So the three kinds of dukkha that the Buddha taught, and in the famous Dhamma Chakra Pravartana Sutta, the Buddha has given the very extensive definition of the dukkha, and we have seen it in the previous classes, that jati pi dukkha, jara pi dukkha, marnang pi dukkha, vyadhi pi dukkha, piyehi sampayogo pi dukkho, piyehi viyogyo pi dukkho, appiyehi sampayogo pi dukkho, and yampi cham na labati tampi dukkham. In a nutshell, sankitena pancha upadan khandapi dukkha. So the burden of 5 skandhas that we carry, the attachment that we have with nama rupa, is ultimately the dukkha. That is how the Buddha defined it in the Dhamma Chakra Pravartana Sutta. That we are going to see what is the comment of Baba Ambedkar on that particular definition. So let's keep on reading. So there is a sermon on record from which it is clear that the Buddha was very much aware that poverty was a cause of sorrow. So see, we have seen in the previous classes also that the Buddha didn't deny that, if there is a social structure, if there is an economic structure in a way that is constructed, it can lead to a lot of suffering. And so is poverty. Poverty leads to suffering. And, therefore, one of the criteria by which Baba Ambedkar, accepted the Buddha's teaching was this, that the Buddha doesn't ennoble or glorify the poverty, like other religious system which glorify or ennoble poverty. So in that sermon, the Buddha says, monks, is poverty a woeful thing for a worldly wanton? Surely, Lord. And when a man is poor, needy, in straits, he gets into debt. And is that awful too? That's what the Buddha asks. Surely, Lord. And when he gets into debt, he borrows, and is that awful too? Surely, Lord. And when the bill falls due, he pays not, and then they praise him. Is that awful too? So Buddha is defining the cycle of poverty, from which it's very difficult to escape. The abject poverty from which it's very difficult to escape for some people. So when we borrow some money, and if we fail to give them back, and we are being praised to give it back, isn't that a woeful state? It's a very difficult state for any human being. Surely when pressed, he pays not, and they beset him. Is that awful too? Surely, Lord. And when beset, he pays not, and they bind him. Is that awful too? So failure to pay. The people who fail to pay, they are enslaved by the debtors, and therefore the Buddha says, isn't that woeful too? Surely, Lord. Thus, monks, poverty, debt, borrowing, being pressed, beset, and bound are all woes for the worldly wanton. Awful in the world is poverty and debt. Thus, the Buddha's conception of dukkha is material. You see, now this can sound very little bit controversial, because when we talk about Buddhism, and Baba Ambedkar has himself taught that in Buddhism the mind is the center, mind is the creator of all our experiences, and it's the mind that leads to not being able to see as it is the cause of suffering. And we have seen that in the previous classes. And here is a statement where in verse number 23, thus the Buddha's conception of dukkha is material. You see, we won't have to necessarily indulge into the debate of mind and matter, because as we know that the reality is interdependent. The mind cannot be separated from matter, matter cannot be separated from mind. That is what the Buddha taught. And therefore, this just to understand that the Buddha's Dhamma is not pessimistic, the Buddha's Dhamma is not gloomy, we can understand this beautiful concept that the Buddha's Dhamma is not otherworldly. It's not, it has to do with only with life after death, or with the life after death. It has to do with our day-to-day being. It has to do with how it can remove or help to remove the dukkha that we experience because of the lack of certain wants and certain needs we all have. So we all have certain needs. All the human beings have certain needs, and if they are not fulfilled, like hunger, or when we are suffering or having health, having no medicines, or if we are poor by whatever circumstances there are, and because of that we suffer, and we go for debt, and ultimately we are enslaved because we are not able to pay the debt, then it creates immense suffering for the humanity. And the Buddha is not denying that anywhere. The Buddha is, in other words, the Buddha is not denying the existence of social and economic suffering. And you see, the world today, as we all witness, that there's immense violence and suffering because of certain social structures, certain economic structures. And Baba Ambedkar was very wise, and he has said in a lot of times that we can derive from the Buddha's Dhamma the theories and the practices which can be useful for today, and they can be interpreted in terms of the social and political. And we don't have to worry about the word social and political, and just push the Buddhism in the psychological direction, because everything is interrelated. Not that easy to separate Buddhism in terms of the psychological, social, and economical. But there are various ways by which we can look at the Buddha's teachings and construct the methods or practices in the world that can help to eradicate the suffering. So the Buddha says very clearly that there are social and economic causes of suffering, and we all know that we don't need to be taught into that there are no social and economic causes for the suffering. And so this is what is the take of the Buddha on dukkha. So dukkha, understanding the dukkha in all different ways is very important. It is not just one way that the Buddha has taught about dukkha. And I find it very interesting in Baba Sahib's writings that, the way he expounds and explains in different ways about, the Buddha's teachings. And I think that is the attitude that we need. We cannot be just accept everything on its face value, as we have seen again in the previous classes of the Buddha and Dhamma, that the mind of inquiry, the mind of not, even I would say skeptic mind, not to take everything for granted, but to explore, examine, understand it as it is. And that's very important. So we are pressed, by the Buddha and Baba Sahib Ambedkar to understand, to not take anything on its face value. And I think that's very important. So the second subpart of the subpart 4 is impermanence as the cause of gloom. And I think this is a very interesting sort of the teachings of the Buddha, impermanence. And we all know that, there is an impermanence. Everybody accepts that there are impermanence. The word cannot be otherwise. But despite of the fact of impermanence, all the philosophies, religions try to create some kind of a permanence in terms of the soul and in terms of the God. And it has to do with what is called the, we have seen in the philosophical traditions, both Indian and Western traditions, to create something which is immutable, something ideal. That's how the word ideal is used in the philosophical sense. When we talk about, it's not just about mental, it's about something there is, which never changes. And for example, to give you an example of Platonic doctrine, where there are horses, but there is a quality called horseness, and the quality this which Plato called form, which never changes. So there are many horses, but behind that reality of many horses, there is a quality of horseness, and which is impermanent. But we know that there is nothing like horseness. And the Buddhist philosophers, like particularly Dharmakirti, has challenged it. He says that, he gives a very beautiful example of how to accept something as true or valid. If it can be established by experiments or it's useful to the humanity. For example, he says that the bread, for example, the it has the meaning in terms of the action because it fulfills our hunger. But the picture of the bread is not real because it doesn't fulfill our need. It doesn't satisfy our hunger. So you see, this is the word of ideas, in a sense of forms, or something that never changes, you know is not an acceptable idea in Buddhism. Buddha didn't find anything that doesn't change. The labels or concepts, they also undergo change. And many a times the concepts that we hold in our minds, we are so much attached to them that they create a kind of a word for us which is very static in terms of the ideas. But the Buddha says that even the ideas have this use. So later the Buddhist philosophers like Dharmakirti, Dignag have gone through a very deep, in-depth philosophical sort of endeavor where they try to understand or explain to us as to what constitute the Buddhism. If something works, is the truth. If something doesn't work, or it's only in the realm of ideas, it's not true. And something works in a sense of experiments. So in the science, everything has to be based on the evidences. We cannot accept something which is just speculative. So in other words, the Buddha asks us to be wary of speculative thinking. So here, this looks very small, only 12 verses. But if we deconstruct these 12 verses, we begin to see the profundity of the Buddha's teachings. And I'm going to read it through again and derive some kind of a meaning out of it. So impermanence as the cause of gloom, because the word is impermanent. The Buddha taught that the impermanence is the very swabhav of everything. It's very beautiful, because what is the nature of everything? The fundamental nature of everything is the change. It cannot be otherwise. If something doesn't change, it cannot exist. So impermanence is what creates everything. And that's very profoundly taught by the Buddha. Something which never change cannot come into existence. So whatever is always changing. And in the previous parts of the Buddha and Dhamma, there is no being. Everything is becoming all the time, isn't it? We are not the same. Though we have the semblance of the same person, we are never changed. Every day we undergo numerous change. Even our perceptions undergo numerous changes. So let's understand this doctrine of impermanence. And impermanence is not gloomy. Because of it, everything is possible, isn't it? If it has not been for change or impermanence, nothing would be possible. We won't be even talking. We won't be even, taking birth. Even we won't be dying. Nothing will happen in the world if the things are static in nature. If the swabhav or the inherent quality of everything is permanent, nothing can move in the world. Nothing can come to existence. So for anything to come into being, it's very important to have this. It is the nature of everything to undergo changes, and every moment. And that moment, in Buddhism, that is in the Indian language, that is called the Shanik Vad, or in the English we can call it momentariness. Momentariness, things exist from moment to moment, one moment leading to another moment, one moment leading to another moment, isn't it? And a lot of moments, coming into being, and there are many causes and conditions, but the fundamental reality is momentary. The fundamental fact of everything is momentariness. So from that background of a discussion, let's read what Baba Sahib says. Impermanence as the cause of gloom. Another ground for this accusation arises from the doctrine that everything which is compound is impermanent. Now, very beautiful. Everything which is compound is impermanent. Whatever is conditionally created, whatever is an assemblage, is impermanent. The things cannot assemble if they are not permanent. There are many logical theories in Buddhism itself to prove these points, and the Buddhists have gone forth in developing a lot of theories which we can even read today. So everything which is compound is impermanent. Whatever, our bodies are compounded. They are the assemblies. Upadana khanda. Khanda is what is called a compound. And everything that is compounded is permanent, impermanent. And there is nothing in the world which is not compounded, except what is called the nirvana or sky, which is supposed to be the space, which is not which is not considered to be compounded in Buddhism. So nobody questions the truth of the doctrine. Nobody can question it. Everybody has to accept it. That's the basic truth of everything. Everything is impermanent is admitted by all. The doctrine, if it is true, must be told just as truth must be told, however unpleasant it may be. So, if the reality is X, we cannot teach it as Y. What is X is X. If there is a horse, we cannot say that that's a donkey. We have to accept whatever it is as it is, even if it is unpleasant. As we have seen previously in the class, that the Buddha has taught us to accept everything as it is. And if we don't accept the thing as it is, it's us who suffers, isn't it? We are going to suffer because we don't accept the way it is or accept as it is, even if it's bitter, isn't it? We have to accept it. We cannot sugarcoat the reality and live in a distorted world, because the more we live in a distorted reality or world, we are going to suffer. So the doctrine, if it is true, must be told just as truth must be told, however unpleasant it may be. But why draw a pessimistic conclusion? So why draw a pessimistic conclusion? And the verse number 6 is nice. If life is short, it is short, and no one needs to be gloomy about it. So if our life is 60 years, 70 years, 100 years, is short, isn't it? This is how it is. And what is there to be gloomy about it? Because that is the reality, isn't it? It's the reality that, we, after certain, years, our body cannot withstand, our body withers away, our minds withers away. And, it's the nature of the things to wither away. And if that happens, why there is a need to be gloomy about it? And that's very beautifully put here. And it is just a matter of interpretation. So how we interpret, and we can make sense of this, you know. So whatever we experience in the world, we interpret it in several ways, but the fact remains the fact, isn't it? If we in some of the Tibetan texts, it said, when we die, we die. When we live, we live. And it looks simple, but it's very profound. If we are going to live 100 years, okay. If we're going to live 50 years, is okay, isn't it? So if life is short, it's short, and one need not be gloomy about it. The Burmese interpretation is very much different. So you see, now there is a interpretation about the death, or about the shortness of life. So, but what is the Burmese interpretation? The Burmese celebrate the event of death in a family as though it was an event of joy. So that's the Burmese tradition. And even in the Tibetan traditions, or in other Buddhist traditions, the death is normalized. It is not put into a closet. It's not put. The reality of the death is, sometimes we run away from it, and we want to hide ourselves from it. We think that it's not going to happen to us, but the death is a reality, and it's a matter of interpretation as to how do we interpret it, whether we run away from the fact of it, or we embrace it as it is. And I think that's important to understand. The Burmese celebrate the event of death in a family as though it was an event of joy. On the day of death, the householders gives a public feast, and the people remove the dead body to the graveyard dancing. Nobody minds the death, for it was to come. So it's very, very profound. It's not easy to understand this doctrine that, nobody minds the death, for it was to come. So now, there are a lot of things which are written about death. One of the things is, how we all try to live in a way that we are never going to die, isn't it? When somebody dies, we think that it happens to them, but we don't understand that, someday it's going to happen to us, and it has to happen to us today or tomorrow. It is bound to happen to us. Is a reality that will struck sooner or later, isn't it? And the fact is that we never know when it is going to strike. And the death is certain, but what is uncertain is we don't know when it's going to happen. And it's very beautifully put here. What is there to feel pessimistic about it? It's the fact of the life. And if we want to evade from the fact, or if we want to evade from the reality of it, it is we are going to. So if we are not going to accept something as it is, then it's us who are going to suffer. And I think that's wonderfully put here. If impermanence is pessimistic, it is only because permanence was assumed to be true, although it was a false one. Very profound. That's what is the beauty of reading the Buddha and his Dhamma. Because Baba Ambedkar clears everything to a perfection, isn't it? He's somebody who applies his mind, and experience to teaching the Dhamma. And therefore, when we read the classic like Buddha and his Dhamma, even a single sentence has a potential to convey us the reality or the truth. Now you just pay attention to this verse number 11. Very profound, simple, but very profound. If impermanence is pessimistic, if we think that the anicca is pessimistic, it is only because why we feel that the anicca is pessimistic, because permanence was assumed to be true, although it was a false one. Because we assume that everything is nicca, everything is permanent, we assume that we are permanent. Because of that assumption, we think that impermanence is pessimistic. It's very beautiful. It's so beautifully captured here that we as if we are living in a false reality, as if we are living in the falsity. We are living in a denial, if we say. And because we live in a denial, something which is true, we don't live in accordance with the true, and we want to sugarcoat it, or even we try to, how to say, put a mask on it. And I think this verse number 11 is worth pondering again and again, isn't it? Because it's very beautifully worded here by Baba Ambedkar. If impermanence is pessimistic, it is only because permanence was assumed to be true, although it was a false. So our assumption that the things never change, or things don't change, or I'm not going to die, or nobody, or the people I love are not going to die. If we have this assumption, then we think that impermanence is pessimistic. So the verse number 12 is Buddha's preaching cannot therefore be charged as spreading gloom. So you cannot say that the Buddha's teaching is gloomy, or, Buddhism is one of the philosophies that talks about the joy, the joy that comes with the freedom, the joy that comes with accepting the reality as it is. And when we accept something as it is, we experience that tremendous joy. So I'm going to go on to the third subsection. Is Buddhism pessimistic? So is the doctrine of the Buddha pessimistic? So let's look at it. The Buddha's Dhamma has been accused of creating pessimism. The accusation arises from the first Aryan truth, which says that there is dukkha, sorrow, misery in the world. It is rather surprising that such a reference to dukkha should give cause to such an accusation. So you see, we all know the Four Noble Truths, and we know that Baba Ambedkar has his interpretation of the Four Noble Truths. And I'm going to tell you one secret of the Buddhism. It doesn't talk about dukkha much, It talks about the nibbana. It talks about how we can cultivate our human personality. It talks about how we can cultivate our mind. It doesn't talk about much about the dukkha, though it talks about the dukkha as the fact of the life. But it's not the only thing, isn't it? There is an escape from the dukkha. There is an end to the dukkha. So let's look at it. It's rather surprising that a reference to dukkha should give cause to such an accusation. Karl Marx, for example, also said that there is exploitation in the world, and the rich are being made richer and the poor are being made poorer. And yet nobody had said that Karl Marx's doctrine is pessimism. Nobody says about Karl Marx that he has talked about exploitation all the time, exploitation inbuilt, in the human societies. And despite of that, nobody accuses Karl Marx of being pessimistic. Why then should a different attitude be shown to the Buddha's doctrine? It may be because the Buddha is reported to have said in his first sermon, birth is sorrowful, jatipi dukkha, old age is sorrowful, jarapi dukkha, death is sorrowful, marnangpi dukkham. That's a deeper pessimistic coloring has been given to his Dhamma. So, as I said, the Buddha has indeed said those things in the Dhamma Chakra Pravartana Sutta. But now there is another side to it. But those who know rhetoric know that this is an artifice of exaggeration and that it is practiced by skilled literary hands to produce effect. It's very beautiful to communicate that rawness of the dukkha, that, dukkha is everywhere. If there is no prajna, there is dukkha. If there is no insight, there is a dukkha. That's what the Buddhism ultimately boils down to. If there is no nirvana, there is dukkha. And, the doctrine of nirvana is the ultimate happiness, mahasukha. And the mahasukha comes with our progressive weakening of the bonds and the poisons like raga, dvesha, and moha. The more they are broken, the more happier we are. And that's what the Buddha has taught. If we throw away a lot of this baggage, we move very fast towards the nirvana. And the doctrine of nibbana is so critical, is so important. The Buddha is nothing, the Buddha is defined in terms of the nibbana. The Buddha is not defined in terms of the dukkha. The Buddha is defined in terms of the nibbana, the very possibility that, we can end the suffering or the dukkha. So for those who know rhetoric is a science of, how we argue or how we try to persuade. And elsewhere, I have spoken about how Baba Ambedkar was very persuasive. And, he used the language in a way to persuade about something. And the Buddha was a master teacher. The Buddha was a teacher par excellence. And, he has this very unique style of making an impact on the minds of the people to persuade them. And we have seen how in different contexts with the different, kinds of people the Buddha has taught. So, what Baba Ambedkar is saying, but those who know rhetoric knows that this is an artifice of exaggeration and that it is practiced by skilled, literally hands to produce effect. That birth is sorrowful is an exaggeration by the Buddha, can be proved by reference to a sermon of his in which he has preached that birth as a human being is a very precious thing. There is this beautiful sutta, how precious is the birth of a human being. And the Buddha has given this very, off quoted example of a turtle, somewhere on the surface of the ocean, on the depth of the ocean, and on the surface there is a ring. And after every 100 years, the turtle comes out for breathing, and the chance of that ring and the neck of that, turtle fixing, is very rare. And the Buddha says that such is the rarer, even the birth of a human being is so rarer. And because it's so rare, it's so precious. So don't squander the opportunity to practice Dhamma. That is what the Buddha has been teaching. So, of course, there is this sermon, very beautiful sermon, which talks about how precious is the human life. And we cannot say that whatever is precious is, full of suffering. It's up to us how we take it. It's a matter of interpretation. So interpretation is also a rhetorical exercise, and we all have to learn how we can come up to the proper interpretations of the things. But, that birth, again, if the Buddha had merely referred to dukkha, such an acquisition could be sustainable. If the Buddha said that, the world is gloomy, the world is full of suffering, and the Buddha has not taught anything else, then we could say that the Buddha's Dhamma is pessimistic. Again, but the Buddha's second Aryan truth emphasizes that this dukkha must be removed. In order to emphasize the duty of removal of dukkha, he spoke of existence of dukkha. You see, this is actually the third Aryan truth. Okay, so there is a small correction because it was published after the death of Baba Ambedkar. So the third noble truth talks about the removal of the dukkha. Actually, it can be second also because the Trishna has to be removed. Because the Trishna being the cause of suffering, it has to be removed. So it can be second. The third is Nibbana, the removal of the dukkha. So he's right, So the second noble truth talks about whatever is the cause of the dukkha has to be removed. So the sentence is right. The second Aryan truth emphasizes that this dukkha must be removed. So there is a famous teaching, this how the dukkha comes into being, because our mind indulges into this and that object all the time, and full of delight and indulgence. And the Buddha talks about the three kinds of Trishna: Kama Trishna, Bhava Trishna, Vibhava Trishna, and removal of them. The removal of the Trishna is ultimately the end of the dukkha. So this is a valid sentence. But the word we can also look at the third Aryan truth, which talks about Nibbana, isn't it? And the fourth noble truth talks about the noble eightfold path, the path leading to the Nibbana. So if why the Buddha teaches dukkha? In order to emphasize the duty of removal of dukkha, he spoke of the existence of dukkha. To the removal of dukkha or the dukkha, the Buddha attached great importance. It is because he found that Kapila merely stated that there was dukkha and said nothing more about it that he felt dissatisfied and left the ashram of Muni Alarakalam. Now, the Sankhya ashram, we know when we studied that the Buddha went away from the Sankhya philosophy, from the ashram of Muni Alarakalam, because they only talked about dukkha, they only talked about unrest, but they didn't teach the end of suffering, how to end the suffering. And the Buddha was the first person, as we know in the history, he found the profound path of removal of the dukkha, and that is noble eightfold path. So I think that discussion is very important to understand that the Buddha's teaching cannot be qualified as pessimistic, as something gloomy. And on the other hand, we can see that the Buddha's teaching is full of joy. If we have to call it a religion, it's a religion of joy. So let's look at the fifth and sixth before we close today. Subparts: critics of theory of soul and rebirth. So always this is criticized that the Buddha has denied the existence of soul, because everything is momentary. Everything has to arise and pass away. There is no possibility of anything concrete or anything, what we can say, anything permanent. And therefore, there is no question of something which never changes, like what is being taught in other religions in terms of soul. So let's look at here, and we have already seen that how Baba Ambedkar has talked about the theory of soul and rebirth. And here, a very categorical statement on rebirth. It's a recurrence of the same patterns. Like the same seeds will lead to the same kind of a tree. If we have a papaya tree, it will plant the papaya seed, it will lead to the papaya tree. If mango seed, mango tree. If the humans, DNA, human beings. So you see, so recurrence of a pattern. And in the Buddhist parlance, there is not the word punarjanma. There is a word called punarbhava, becoming again and again. And the Trishna is like that. It makes us become again and again, crave for the same thing again and again. Isn't it? Recurrence of the Trishna is also the rebirth of the same thing. Rebirth can be understood, interpreted in many ways. Not just, whether I'm going to be born after my death. That's a very limited way by which we can understand rebirth. Isn't it? So the Blessed Lord preached that there was no soul. The Blessed Lord also affirmed that there was rebirth. And the Buddha said that there is punarbhav. There are certain patterns which comes into existence again and again. Isn't it? But that doesn't mean that, there is a rebirth of some kind of a soul which migrates from this body to that body. Very beautifully, Buddha explained. Let me try to explain to you. It's like if we have seen the the balls of snooker, and if one ball hits another ball, the ball gets energy from the ball that hits it, and the ball is in motion. It doesn't, what is transferred between the two? So one moment leading to another moment, what is transferred between them? And that was a very beautiful question that has been put by the Buddhist philosopher. So one thing leads to another. So when one thing leads to another, what happens? So if I cause something to happen, is something from this is transferred to that. So in this simple example of one ball hitting another ball, what is it? That the ball is transferring to another ball. Some kind of atma, some kind of, something which doesn't change, energy, isn't it? So the Buddha says from the moment to moment, the things are impacting on each other. That doesn't mean that, something is transferring from here to there. What is it that transferred from here to there? Very fundamental question, which I will leave you to think about. So they were not wanting people who criticized the Lord for preaching what they regarded as two such contradictory doctrines. How can there be rebirth if there is no soul? Because there is no soul, that's why the things recur again and again. Very, very important, because certain patterns are already set, as we see in the world. For example, the trees, there are certain kind of patterns which comes into existence because of a particular DNA, particular, seed. Isn't it? So in the DNA, the whole human being is programmed. That doesn't mean that there is a need of any soul there. And that has been very beautifully explained by, in the science or arts in, elsewhere. So how can there be rebirth if there is no soul? They asked. There is no contradiction, says the Buddha. There can be rebirth even though there is no soul. There is a mango stone, the seed of a mango. The stone gives rise to a mango tree. The mango tree produces mangoes. You see, this pattern continues. The mango seed giving rise to the mango tree. The mango tree produces the mangoes, and the mangoes further produces the mango trees. Isn't it? So something like, something like that happens to us. All the time it's happening to us. So here is a rebirth of a mango. Now the mango that is born from this one mango seed, is it different or the same? What is it? Isn't it? So this mango seed was the cause of this mango tree. So you see, the answers are not simple. We have to apply our minds, to think through the things and analyze at that level. to understand what is being taught. Not just that, because there is, a soul is important for a rebirth. The Buddha never talks about the transmigration. There is no transmigration of soul from this body to that body. But my previous body has conditioned me to this body. When I was a child, I was different. So, but that child has not died. See, this is very profound. So here is the rebirth of a mango, but there is no soul. So there can be rebirth, although there is no soul. You see, the Krishna comes into existence again and again. A lot of patterns, our habits, born again and again. They are reborn again and again. So the last section, the section number 6, and then we will end it because it's also 6 verses, but they are also very important. Once when the Lord was staying at Shravasti in Jeta's Grove, it was reported to him that a certain bhikkhu by name Aritta had come to certain views about the doctrine taught by the Lord as the views of the Lord, although they were not the views of the Lord. So Aritta had come to the Lord saying that, the Lord has taught what Lord has taught. He was teaching in a contrary way. And this is a very significant, sutra in Buddhism, that Aritta comes to the Buddha and, he misrepresents his teaching. So one of the doctrines about which Aritta was misrepresenting the Lord was whether he was an annihilationist. So whether the Buddha believed in the total destruction of everything. So when we are talking about impermanence, we think that we are talking about the total destruction. The Buddha never talked the total destruction of the humanity. The Buddha never talked about the destruction of the world. The Buddha was, in other words, not Uchchedvadi, annihilationist. Buddha was not a Uchchedvadi. And Buddha says that, that's one extreme, to believe that everything is going to get destroyed. And there is another, extremity, which is like everything is going to remain as it is. Isn't it? The Buddha was saying, follow the middle path. And what was the middle path? To understand that, the world is not going to, completely be destroyed. So what is it? And that's what the Buddha was accused of, that he is somebody who talks about Uchchedvad. Everything will be destroyed. And the Buddha says that this is a wrong representation of my teaching. The blessed Lord sent for Aritta. Aritta came. On being questioned, he sat silent and gloom. The Lord then said to him, some recluses and Brahmins wrongly, erroneously, and falsely charge me in defiance of facts with being an annihilationist and with preaching disintegration and extirpation of existing creatures. It is just what I am not and what I do not affirm. What I have consistently preached both in the past and today is the existence of ill and the ending of all ill. You see, so, all the time the Buddha has talked about what he's teaching to the humanity. He's teaching that, we suffer a lot and there is a dukkha. And the Buddha taught that, we can end the dukkha. And if we focus on only this, we can understand everything. And, there is a very beautiful sutta where the Buddha in the forest holds a handful of leaves and he asks his disciple, so, whether the handful of leaves in my hand are far in number than the leaves in the entire forest. And the obvious answer is this, that the leaves in the hands are very few and the leaves in the forest are in multitude, even so many to, count. And therefore, it's up to us to understand that it's up to us to understand the basic teachings of the Buddha. If we can understand the basic teachings of the Buddha, then we can understand everything. We don't have to, the section of the Buddha and his Dhamma, the section number 6 is very clear. And we have seen in such a short period, or in a few pages, Baba Ambedkar has explained the core teachings of the Buddha so well and so beautifully. So here we end our class today, and we will open up for the question and answer. So anything that anybody would like to say?
Here, in charge of preaching, dukkha is the cause of gloom. Poverty is said to be cause of sorrow. This is particularly mentioned because in Brahmanism, Hinduism, they say that if even you are poor, it is because of the past birth. You are suffering because of the past karma. You are suffering in this life. So they say that you cannot rise from that status, improve your status, because they have given their theory to believe. So particularly in this, it is mentioned that poverty is the cause of sorrow.
Good.
It should not be taken as otherwise.
Good comment. Good comment. So anything from anybody? Sorry, the class was extended today for more, because I think there were some very important points here that needed to be discussed. And you see how, if we keep on reading the Buddha and his Dhamma, it helps us to clarify for ourselves a lot of things that, we held in suspension for some time. So that's why, I encourage all of you to read the Buddha and his Dhamma as many times as we can. We can make it a daily practice to read the Buddha and his Dhamma. So if there is nothing today, we will...
It is clearly mentioned that there is no rebirth, because as there is no soul, there is no rebirth.
Yes.
It is the energy which flows from time to time. True. Consciousness. And the rebirth, Dr. Baba Sahib has explained in different ways. There is rebirth of whom and rebirth of what. So there should not be any doubt that there is rebirth. And we don't expect that, except that there is no soul, then there cannot be rebirth. Even if there is no soul, rebirth is not there.
Good. Okay, then if there is nothing pressing on anybody's mind, we can end the class today and meet next week. Thank you so much. Jai Bhim.
Yes, thank you, sir.
Maybe.
Thank you. Jai Bhim to all.